Welcome to this episode of a special A Shot in the Arm podcast coming to you from the World Health Assembly in Geneva, Switzerland. And yes, we are being graciously hosted by UNAIDS in their recording studio. And in this episode, I am joined by Professor Heidi Larson, a very, very good friend of mine. And we've got a bit of news to talk about that at the end. The founder of the Vaccine Confidence Project and the founder of a new project, the Global Listening Project. Heidi, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So you are here at WHA. You've got an absolutely packed agenda. What's your message really to the delegates from countries here?
Well, building on the 13 plus years of the Vaccine Confidence Project and before, and now expanding to the Global Listening Project, the importance of societal preparedness in this broader agenda of emergency response and preparedness, which is one of the significant themes of WHA. So I'm here talking about the importance of making sure we don't forget society in the focus on systems.
Yeah, I really wanted to press you on that. He says that we're putting our cell phones on stun for these podcast recordings, but that's probably people telling us that we need to be in all sorts of receptions. But society is the foundation for preparedness. How does that work? How do you concretely advise pandemic preparation wonks, whether they're in governments or non-profits or academic institutions, to take societies and take communities seriously? And what are the kind of disciplines, academic and data disciplines, that you use to prove the case?
Well, I think a lot of pandemic preparedness and other preparedness efforts always mention the importance of community, but I haven't seen too many that actually talk about the how. And one of the things that we've learned, and certainly has come loud and clear during COVID, is you don't do that in the moment of the emergency. We've learned that in the Polio Eradication Initiative, which is another theme of the WHA, that really we need to be engaging people, not just to listen to them, to persuade them to accept whatever health interventions, but also they've got a lot of good ideas. And I think that we have a lot to learn from communities. They can help guide us on what's better timing for some of the interventions, what are the sensitivities, how can we get around it? I mean, it's basically something that was so fundamental in the AIDS response, particularly since we didn't have treatment yet in the beginning. We still don't have a vaccine. We were relying so much on behavioral, societal engagement. And it's something that I thought was quite a desert when it came to vaccines. And in some other ways. So in terms of metrics, one of the things we're doing, which is the core pillar, I should say, of the Global Listening Project, is we've done a lot of focus groups in different parts of the world, listening to people's experience of the pandemic. What were the things? Who did they trust? Who did they turn to? What helped them? What were they missing? This is like once in a century experience. If we don't capture that, we're missing a whole lot of valuable insights. And then from that, distilling what do these different settings around the world have in common? And we use that to inform what we're calling the Global Societal Preparedness Index. We'll be rolling that out, as you know, in 70 countries in the next couple months. And hopefully that'll give us like a baseline of what are the core elements of societal preparedness, which will vary depending on, in some settings, we're going to see people were really strong around one area, in another place, another area, weak spots, strong spots. How do we build on the innovation, and how do we try to address the gaps?
And I mean, I suppose two things come from that. The first is that here at the World Health Assembly, there is discussion of the Pandemics Treaty, Pandemics Preparation and Response Treaty. And I just wonder how valuable you think that is going to be.
Well, treaties are a start. Treaties are something you can refer to make your case that the world has decided this is important. But treaties and conventions, they're fantastic for convening and getting agreement at a certain level, but they have no teeth at a country level or at a local level unless specific countries actually own and implement some of the what's written in those treaties. So great to have a global treaty, great to make sure that there's some global standard that people at least at a higher level agree to. But unless we, after it's all signed off on, countries take it home and own it or find out maybe they can't own it all actually at home, and there are, 3 or 4, maybe 5 pieces of it that make sense in their setting and work with that. So, it's a start. It's an important start, but I
But do you
wouldn't hang
think
my hat on it.
do you think coming out of COVID, particularly when we saw nationalism around data collection, nationalism around how much of a an impact COVID was having on their countries, their societies, and of course the nationalism that we saw around the vaccine distribution. Do you think it is possible, particularly in this increasingly atomized world, that countries are going to work together, are going to share with WHO information that will enable WHO to provide a more concrete set of guidance on what's happening?
Well, I think nationalism has gotten it's gotten a bad name in the context of vaccines, and I don't think it's totally fair because I think, we have to appreciate that leaders, like Modi, for instance, who you can have all kinds of opinions about some leaders, but it's not I don't think it's unfair or unrealistic for a national leader to want to make sure that he protects people or she protects people in their country. I think we need a certain amount of that. I mean, you also don't want a leader who cares about the rest of the world and not taking care of people at home. So, I think we need to find this realistic balance of saying, we should be realizing that some leaders, particularly when they have, absolutely fatal outbreaks in their own settings, that they're going to do everything they can to keep their population healthy and safe. They were exporting vaccines before that major outbreak, and they resumed that afterwards.
Now,
But
you're talking about Modi, the president of
yes,
India, and India, of
yes,
course, had a really dreadful outbreak very
yes.
soon into the first wave of COVID.
Yes, that's the context, and it was I particularly, brought attention to India because India was absolutely one of the biggest producers of vaccines in general, particularly for children, but also in this case for COVID. And the global response was very much depending on that, especially since we didn't have as many choices as we're increasingly getting. But I think for a message for that moving forward is the importance of regionalism, the importance of building capacity. And if there's a silver lining in COVID, for instance, it's really fired up, particularly in Africa, that was the most left out continent in terms of access to vaccine. To really, there's been increased investment and efforts to build manufacturing capacity in Africa. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but at least there's a concerted effort. Efforts to have an African Medicines Authority, like the European Medicines Authority, like other regions, efforts to have, different kinds of local efforts. I think that's been really positive. It's going to take time because it also needs human resources.
So I agree with you there. I think if there is one silver lining coming out of COVID, it is that countries cannot rely on the largesse of the international community. And instead of individual countries building up capacity, say vaccine or medication capacity, it's going to have to be regionally done. And we're certainly seeing some really creative work being done in Africa through the Africa CDC and the African Union. Um, so, so taking you forward, you created the Global Listening Project. What are you looking to do with this?
Well, for one thing, I think it will be an absolutely historic document because, as I said, documentation of what the experience of COVID was for societies around the world and communities. As I said, we haven't had something of this level for a century. So that in itself will be valuable, a valuable resource for preparedness. More specifically, as we get data collected and insights from each of the countries, we'll be having real time roundtables with relevant local policymakers. As we pick up on themes that come up, we'll have thematic exchanges. We don't want to set up yet another pandemic preparedness or crisis preparedness initiative. We want to be at the table of pandemic preparedness. This is totally appropriate and needed for also the climate preparedness, climate change preparedness. This is ultimately about cooperation and what can we learn from publics to help lubricate and trust build, because we're also at an all-time low with trust. Higher in some places than others, but that's different in different settings. So I'm hoping that we're not going to wait for not I'm hoping that this will help inform that real-time engagement of societies, and we are not going to wait until our final or our first report launches at the end of the year or January 2024. We're going to be engaging around this data in real time, in real settings.
Have you thought about the role technology plays in this? Because, of course, one of the great things, I mean, you were covering the question of misinformation around vaccines for many years before the COVID pandemic, and then COVID hit, and no longer were you Cassandra, a voice speaking in the wilderness, as it were. You were absolutely there and relevant. But do you think that, well, artificial intelligence, the use of digital and social media, but also trust in broader science, not just technology, is that something that you see part of the remit?
Absolutely. That came up in so many settings. How, on the one hand, society enabled us to stay connected at a certain level, but it also divided populations because not everyone, I mean, there were some families might have had four kids, one or two parents working at home, and maybe one device in their household. That how can you homeschool four kids in different levels and a parent needing to work? A lot of parents didn't, the nature of their work didn't allow working at home. It just wasn't, it was much more hands on. And so technology worked for those that it worked for, but also things like QR codes, the amount of contact tracing, the appointment, you had to make your appointments in some settings for vaccines, the amount that you had to go through for any kind of travel was negotiating and navigating so much technology. And then there was the new technology and innovation around vaccines themselves. People hadn't heard about mRNA before and the platform that's producing it. So we had a lot of new things coming at people at a time where there was so much uncertainty. All they wanted was something familiar. And so I think that that's something that we want to socialize technology in a different way and also trust build around. Science has had a serious hit in trust, and scientists have never, I mean, we've had unprecedented assaults on scientists. Why? Not because they're scientists per se, but because it was the science that informed these policies. So a lot of publics are blaming the scientists. It's because of you that I was locked down. It's because of you that I couldn't do X, Y, and Z. More than actually politicians, which I found fascinating and concerning.
So, given all of that, given this spreading out of information, and everyone can be Dr. Google, and everyone can collect their own um, their own their own data to support their opinion. Coming back to Geneva, do you think that the UN institutions are still fit for purpose? In other words, the the decisions that come out of here this week, how much of an impact will they really have?
I think they will have an impact, but again, as we talked about with the treaties, to the extent that, there's many layers of activities going on in Geneva this week around the World Health Assembly. There are the ministers of health sitting in the assembly and going through their issues and shared agendas and coming to, agreement on a number of things. But there's a lot of activities in the orbit around the World Health Assembly, and there you have more community. There you have more different types of issues and lobby things going on. Um, but in terms of the core issue and why we're gathered here, and your point about the UN, is it fit for purpose, or the different agencies? I think we need something like the World Health Organization. We need a UN in the world, like we need an EU, a European Union, particularly when it comes to peace and security, but also in things like health. Whether it's fit for purpose, I think, these were institutions largely set up after the Second World War. They're not all fit for purpose. Maybe their principles are, but their modus operandi is gonna have to change. I think, this is no secret. I think a lot of them know that. Also, we're living in a time where countries, individual countries, wanna have a lot, are want to have a lot more ownership and less dependency on international bodies. So we need to flip this upside down, and they need to be there in almost in the background and not in the foreground, and the countries in the foreground. So the if you can call it power relations, and also the resource base. I think, countries don't want to have to go through a conduit of some of the UN agencies. Um, and I think they need to find where is their niche that can add value to countries, rather than burden with processes.
And it's it, it we're at this point where so much is changing so quickly. We're in an era of polycrises, but we also have some news, don't we?
Yes, the I'm going to turn over to you.
We were fighting over this. Who's going to say this? Well, in
Yes.
fact,
Exciting news.
exciting
Yes.
news. As part of the Global Listening Project, the family of the A Shot in the Arm podcasts are moving over to the Global Listening Project as part of an effort to really listen and document what people are saying. And I'm really excited about that. And I'm really excited to have a chance to work with you again, because we have worked with each other so many times after the last few decades that it is brilliant to have you as my boss.
Well, I'm thrilled with the collaboration, because the Global Listening Project too is about connecting any different efforts that are listening, and different parts of society. And I think the Shot in the Arm and the various other topical podcasts are just such a perfect marriage, so to speak.
Well, super. So watch this space. We'll have a whole set of exciting new content coming with the GLP. So Heidi, it just remains for me to thank you for coming into the portable Shot in the Arm podcast studio here at UNAIDS.
That's what I love about it.
I know, right? And really wishing you the very best for the rest of your very busy schedule here in Geneva.
Thanks so much.
Well, everyone, that's it for this episode. Thank you to Heidi Larson. Thank you to our friends at the Global Health Council. And thank you, of course, to our director and producer, Erica Spera, to our production assistant, Waisha Raphael, and of course, our executive producer extraordinaire, Christine Stegling. So with that, look forward to seeing you in the next episode.